Standing at my own son's wedding reception, champagne glass trembling in my hand, I watched the woman he'd just married lean close to my ear and whisper words that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. Starting tomorrow, you're no longer part of this family, she said with a smile so cold it could freeze hell itself. Welcome to the Mental Grand, where I'm about to tell you how those 9 words became the biggest mistake anyone ever made in my presence. My name is Richard Donovan, and for 37 years, I built a life that most men only dream about. I wasn't born into money or privilege. Every dollar I earned came from sweat, sacrifice, and strategic thinking that turned a small consulting firm into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. My late wife, Margaret, and I raised our son, Trevor, in a beautiful colonial home in Westchester County, New York, giving him every advantage we never had: private schools, summer camps in Switzerland, a trust fund that would activate on his 30th birthday. We didn't just hand him success, we built the runway for it. And I thought, genuinely believed, that I'd raised a man who understood loyalty, family, and respect. The wedding was everything you'd expect from a merger of old money and new ambition. Trevor, my only child, had met Vanessa Hartwell at some charity gala 18 months earlier. She came from Connecticut wealth, the kind where family trees have more branches than actual trees on their estate. Her father, Charles, ran a prestigious law firm in Manhattan, the type where junior partners drove BMWs and senior partners had drivers. Vanessa herself was a corporate attorney, sharp as a scalpel and twice as cold, though I didn't see that clearly until it was too late. She had this way of smiling that never quite reached her eyes, like she was constantly calculating something just behind that perfect facade. The reception was held at the Hartwell estate, a sprawling property with manicured gardens that probably cost more to maintain than most people's mortgages. I'd paid for half of everything, as tradition dictated, though Charles made it clear through subtle comments that his half was the more impressive half. The flowers alone cost $40,000. The band had played at presidential inaugurations. The champagne was older than most of the guests. Everything was perfect, polished, and completely devoid of warmth. That's when I realized something had shifted in my son, something fundamental that I'd been too blind or too trusting to notice. Trevor had been distant for months leading up to the wedding. Phone calls became shorter, visits became rarer, and when we did talk, Vanessa was always there, her presence like a shadow that cooled every conversation. She'd interrupt with corrections, clarifications, little comments that subtly undermined whatever I said. If I mentioned a business success, she'd pivot to how her father's firm had handled something bigger. If I shared a memory of Trevor's childhood, she'd smile tightly and change the subject. My son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike and throw a baseball, would just nod along, his spine seemingly removed the moment she entered a room. The whispered threat came during the father-son dance, or rather, right after it. I'd just finished a waltz with my son, a tradition his mother would have loved to see, and as I stepped away, Vanessa appeared at my elbow. She was radiant in her designer gown, diamonds glittering at her throat, and when she leaned in, anyone watching would have thought she was sharing a warm family moment. Instead, she delivered her poison with surgical precision. "Richard, we need to be clear about something," she whispered, her breath smelling of champagne and entitlement. "Starting tomorrow, you're no longer part of this family. Trevor and I are building something new, something modern, and frankly, your old-fashioned ideas and constant presence are going to be a hindrance. We'll be cordial at holidays if necessary, but don't expect phone calls, visits, or involvement in our lives. Consider this your official notification." I stood there, frozen, as she pulled back and rejoined the crowd with that same calculating smile. My heart hammered in my chest. My vision actually blurred for a moment. In 30 seconds, this woman had attempted to erase me from my own son's life at his wedding, surrounded by 300 witnesses who had no idea what just happened. The audacity was breathtaking. The cruelty was surgical. And the biggest shock was still coming. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about my own family. I looked across the reception hall to where Trevor stood with a group of his college friends, laughing at some joke, and our eyes met for just a moment. I expected to see my son, the boy who'd cried in my arms when his mother died, the young man I'd mentored through business school, the heir to everything I'd built. Instead, I saw a stranger. He held my gaze for exactly 3 seconds, then deliberately turned away, his arms sliding around Vanessa's waist in a gesture that looked almost rehearsed. That's when the truth crashed over me like ice water. He knew. He'd known what she was going to say, might have even helped plan it. This wasn't Vanessa acting alone. This was a coordinated attack. I made it through the rest of the reception on autopilot, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, playing the role of proud father while my world crumbled internally. I drove home to the empty colonial home that night, poured myself 3 fingers of scotch that Margaret had bought me for our 20th anniversary, and sat in my study until sunrise, thinking, processing, planning. You see, I didn't build a multi-million-dollar consulting firm by reacting emotionally to setbacks. I built it by staying calm, gathering information, and executing strategies that my competitors never saw coming. And as I sat there, watching the sun rise over the property I'd worked 30 years to afford, something crystallized in my mind. They thought they were cutting me out. They thought I was just some old man they could discard like outdated furniture. They had absolutely no idea what they'd just set in motion. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 15 years. I called my old friend Marcus Webb, a private investigator, who'd helped me vet business partners and potential acquisitions back when my company was expanding aggressively. Marcus was expensive, discreet, and unnervingly thorough. When I told him I needed a complete background check on my new daughter-in-law and a detailed analysis of my son's recent financial activities, he didn't ask questions. He just quoted me a price and got to work. That's when everything I thought I knew started to unravel in ways I never imagined. While Marcus worked his magic, I focused on what I did best, running my business and reviewing my estate planning. My company, Donovan Strategic Consulting, had contracts with major corporations across 3 continents. We specialized in corporate restructuring and crisis management, helping companies navigate hostile takeovers, bad publicity, and internal conflicts. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was an expert at fixing other people's family businesses while my own family was imploding, but expertise is expertise, and I had tools at my disposal that most scorned fathers never consider. I'd always planned to transition the business to Trevor eventually. He had a junior position in the firm, mostly symbolic, with a nice salary that required minimal actual work. I'd structured that intentionally, giving him income and status while he found his own path. His trust fund was set to release $5 million on his 30th birthday, which was 8 months away. Beyond that, my will left him controlling interest in the company and the bulk of my personal estate, easily worth north of $40 million when you factor in real estate, investments, and business valuation. I'd built an empire, and I'd built it for him. But as I reviewed these documents in my study, a new understanding settled over me like armor. These weren't gifts anymore. They were leverage, and leverage, properly applied, could move mountains or crush them entirely. Marcus called me 6 days after the wedding with a tone in his voice I'd never heard before, something between professional concern and genuine alarm. "Richard, we need to meet in person. What I found, you're going to want to be sitting down, and you're definitely going to want to be somewhere private." Just when I thought betrayal couldn't cut any deeper, I was about to discover I hadn't seen the blade yet. We met at a quiet steakhouse in Manhattan, the kind of place where the booths have high backs and the staff knows not to hover. Marcus slid a thick manila folder across the table before we'd even ordered drinks. His expression was grim, and Marcus had seen everything in his 30 years as an investigator, from corporate espionage to marriage fraud. If he was grim, I knew I was in for something bad. "I'm going to give this to you straight, because that's what you're paying for," he said quietly. Your daughter-in-law, Vanessa Hartwell, has been planning this for at least a year, probably longer. This wasn't a spontaneous decision to cut you out. This was a calculated, methodical strategy, and your son has been a willing participant from the beginning. He opened the folder and started laying out documents like a prosecutor building a case. Bank statements showing that Trevor had been moving money out of his personal accounts into ones jointly held with Vanessa, starting 6 months before the engagement. Email printouts obtained through methods I didn't ask about, showing conversations between Vanessa and her father, Charles, discussing the Donovan situation and how to expedite access to the estate. Text messages between Trevor and Vanessa referring to me as the obstacle and discussing timelines for full control. My hands were shaking as I read, not from fear, but from a rage so pure and cold that it felt almost clarifying. There's more, Marcus continued, his voice dropping even lower. Vanessa has been consulting with estate attorneys on ways to contest your will if anything happens to you. To you. They've been looking into ways to have you declared mentally incompetent. There are notes about finding a doctor who might be willing to testify that you're showing signs of dementia or diminished capacity. And here's the kicker. They've been researching how to force you out of your own company using some obscure corporate bylaws that nobody's looked at in 20 years. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. This wasn't just about cutting me out of Trevor's personal life. This was about taking everything, my company, my assets, my reputation. They wanted me declared incompetent, sidelined, stripped of power, and possibly institutionalized, all so they could get their hands on my life's work without waiting for nature to take its course. How far along are they? I asked, my voice surprisingly steady despite the inferno burning in my chest. Based on the timeline in these documents, I'd say they're planning to make their move within the next 6 months, probably right after Trevor's 30th birthday when his trust fund activates. They want that $5 million secured before they start the legal warfare. They're also counting on you being emotionally devastated and off balance, too hurt to fight back effectively. I sat back in the booth, processing this information with the same analytical mindset I applied to hostile corporate takeovers. They'd made several critical mistakes. First, they'd underestimated me, assuming that a father's love would make me weak rather than dangerous. Second, they'd left a paper trail, probably because they never imagined I'd investigate my own family. And third, and most importantly, they'd showed me their strategy before executing it. In business, there's a saying that I'd built my entire career on. Information is power, but applied information is devastating. Marcus, I said calmly, I need you to keep digging. I want to know every detail of their plan, every person they've consulted, every document they've drafted. I want to know their strategy better than they know it themselves, and I need all of this documented in a way that would hold up in court if necessary. Can you do that? He nodded slowly, a slight smile crossing his face. I was hoping you'd say something like that. There's a version of this where you roll over and die, Richard. I'm glad you're not that guy. I'm not even close to that guy, I replied, my voice carrying an edge that surprised even me. They wanted to cut me out of the family. Fine, but they're about to learn that I built this family, I funded this family, and I can dismantle everything they're counting on with a few signatures and phone calls. The war hasn't even started, and they've already lost. They just don't know it yet. Over the next 3 months, while Trevor and Vanessa enjoyed their honeymoon in the Maldives and settled into their new penthouse apartment, one that I'd given them as a wedding present like the fool I'd been, I quietly assembled a legal and financial fortress that would have made Sun Tzu proud. That's when I realized they had no idea who they were messing with, and by the time they figured it out, it would be far too late. My first call was to Patricia Chen, the best estate attorney in New York, and someone who'd helped me structure my assets years ago when Margaret was still alive. Patricia was in her 60s, sharp as broken glass, and had a reputation for creating legal structures so airtight that they'd made grown men cry during divorce proceedings.
When I explained the situation, leaving nothing out, she was silent for a long moment. Richard, what you're describing is essentially financial elder abuse, or at least the planning stages of it. The fact that it's your own son makes it more painful but not less prosecutable. And the fact that they're this organized means we need to move fast and smart. How scorched earth do you want to go? I want them to have nothing they didn't earn themselves, I replied without hesitation. Everything I built, everything I was planning to leave Trevor, all of it gets restructured. But I want it done in a way that's completely legal, completely unbreakable, and completely devastating when they finally realized what happened. I can do that, Patricia said, and I could hear the keyboard clicking already. Give me 2 weeks and access to all your corporate documents, trusts, and estate plans. When I'm done, you'll be untouchable, and everything they're planning will be worthless. While Patricia worked on the legal framework, I reached out to my corporate board, particularly the 3 independent directors who had no personal connection to Trevor. I called a confidential executive session and laid out everything Marcus had discovered. I showed them the documents, the emails, the plan to potentially force me out of my own company using obscure corporate bylaws that nobody's looked at in 20 years. Their reactions ranged from shock to fury, but the outcome was unanimous. Within 48 hours, the corporate bylaws were amended, requiring a supermajority vote and independent medical assessments from 3 separate specialists before any competency questions could even be raised about sitting board members. Trevor's largely symbolic position was quietly restructured into a consulting role with no voting rights and no path to executive authority. I also started making phone calls to every major client and partner my company worked with, not to badmouth my son, but simply to reinforce relationships and ensure they knew that Donovan Strategic Consulting was and would remain under my leadership for the foreseeable future. In the corporate world, confidence is currency, and I was making sure every stakeholder knew exactly who held the keys to the kingdom. The most painful part came when Patricia presented me with the new estate structure. She'd created a charitable foundation that would receive the bulk of my assets upon my death, funding scholarships and business education programs for underprivileged students. Trevor would receive a fixed annuity of $75,000 per year, inflation adjusted, for life. Comfortable, but not wealthy. Enough to live on, but not enough to live off. The trust fund, said to activate on his 30th birthday, was restructured into a conditional release, requiring him to meet certain milestones that I knew he'd never achieve, primarily demonstrating financial independence and maintaining a positive relationship with me for at least 2 consecutive years. When I signed those documents, I felt something break and heal simultaneously in my chest. 3 months after the wedding, Trevor finally called me, not to apologize, not to reconcile, but to inform me that he and Vanessa were expecting me to sign over power of attorney for my healthcare decisions, just as a precaution given my age. I was 62, by the way, hardly decrepit. The audacity was almost impressive. "Dad, it's really just a formality," Trevor said over the phone, his voice carrying that corporate smoothness that Vanessa probably coached into him. "Vanessa's father, Charles, recommended it. Just in case something happens, we want to make sure your affairs are in order and someone responsible is making decisions." "Someone responsible," I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. "You mean someone like you and your wife who've spent the last 6 months planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so you can seize control of my company and assets." The silence on the other end was deafening. I could practically hear his heart stop. What happened next was the most satisfying conversation I'd had in months, and they were about to learn what real power looks like. "I don't know what you're talking about," Trevor stammered, but his voice had lost all its confidence. "Dad, who's been telling you these things? Are you feeling okay? Maybe we should schedule an appointment with a neurologist, just to—" "Stop," I said, my voice cold and level. I know everything, Trevor. The emails to Vanessa's father, the consultations with estate attorneys, the research into having me declared incompetent, the plans to force me out of my own company, the timeline to make your move right after your 30th birthday. I know all of it. I have documentation for all of it, and I've spent the last 3 months ensuring that none of it will ever work. Another long silence, and then I heard Vanessa's voice in the background, sharp and demanding. What's he saying? Put him on speaker. Hello, Vanessa. I assume you're the architect of this little coup attempt. It has your fingerprints all over it, that combination of legal knowledge and complete sociopathic disregard for human decency. I just want you to know that I've restructured every aspect of my estate, my company, and my assets. The trust fund Trevor was counting on no longer exists in its previous form. The inheritance he was expecting is now going to charity. His position in my company has been reduced to nothing, and I've created legal protections that make your entire strategy worthless. You can't do that. Vanessa's voice came through the phone like a chainsaw. That money is Trevor's birthright. You promised him that company. We have plans. We have commitments. You have nothing, I interrupted, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but carrying more weight than if I'd screamed. You thought you could come into my family, turn my son against me, plot to steal my life's work, and I'd just roll over and die? You thought I was some weak old man you could manipulate and discard. I built an empire from nothing while you were still in diapers. I've navigated corporate warfare that would make your little schemes look like playground tactics, and you made one critical, fatal mistake. What mistake? She hissed. You told me your plan before you executed it. At the wedding, remember? You couldn't help yourself. You had to gloat, had to make sure I knew you were being discarded. That hubris gave me 3 months to dismantle everything you were counting on. So here's what's going to happen. You and Trevor are going to live your
Exactly as you planned, just without my money, without my company, and without me. You wanted me out of the family. Congratulations, you got exactly what you asked for. I hung up before either of them could respond, my hands steady, my heart rate calm, my conscience clear. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Trevor called back 17 times that night, each voicemail more desperate than the last. Vanessa sent emails, text messages, even tried to show up at my house before my security, newly upgraded, turned her away at the gate. Charles Hartwell himself called, threatening legal action, which I calmly informed him would result in me releasing all the documentation Marcus had gathered to the New York State Bar Association, showing his involvement in planning what essentially amounted to elder abuse. That shut him up pretty quickly. But the real devastation came 2 weeks later when Trevor's 30th birthday arrived and the trust fund he'd been counting on didn't activate. The conditions I'd added, primarily maintaining a genuine relationship with me for 2 consecutive years, were clearly unmet. Instead of $5 million landing in his account, he received a letter from Patricia Chen explaining the new structure and the fact that he was now entitled to exactly $75,000 per year, period. I heard through mutual acquaintances, people who were still loyal to me, that the penthouse apartment had to be sold. Apparently, they'd been living well beyond their actual means, counting on that trust fund to cover the gap. The luxury cars got downgraded, the country club membership was canceled, Vanessa's designer wardrobe shopping sprees became consignment store visits. They weren't destitute, they both had decent legal careers, but they were suddenly, shockingly, ordinary. And for people who'd planned to live as millionaires, ordinary felt like poverty. 6 months after my revelation phone call, I received a letter from Trevor. Not an email, not a text, but an actual handwritten letter delivered by courier. In it, he apologized. He claimed he'd been manipulated, that Vanessa had convinced him I was trying to control his life, that her father had painted me as some tyrannical figure who needed to be managed. He said he saw now how wrong he'd been, how he'd betrayed everything his mother and I had taught him, and he begged, really, for a chance to make it right. I read that letter 3 times, sitting in the study where I'd planned my counterattack, and I felt absolutely nothing. Maybe that makes me cold. Maybe that makes me unforgiving. But they'd made their choices with clear eyes and cruel intentions, and now they were living with the consequences. They didn't want reconciliation, they wanted restoration. They didn't miss me, they missed my money, and I was done being someone's retirement plan. That's when I discovered the most powerful form of revenge isn't destruction, it's indifference, and watching them realize they no longer matter at all. I threw myself into my work with renewed energy, expanding the company into new markets and taking on challenging projects that reminded me why I'd built this empire in the first place. I started mentoring young entrepreneurs through a program Patricia had helped me establish, sharing 3 decades of hard-won knowledge with people who actually appreciated it. I traveled, something Margaret and I had always planned to do more of, visiting places we'd only dreamed about. I was 62 years old, healthy, wealthy, and finally free from people who only valued me for what I could provide. The charitable foundation Patricia had created began awarding scholarships to promising business students from backgrounds similar to mine, kids who had drive and intelligence but no family money to fall back on. Every year, I personally met with the scholarship recipients, and every year I saw more genuine gratitude in their eyes than I'd seen from my own son in the last decade. It was healing in a way I hadn't expected. Trevor and Vanessa's marriage, predictably, didn't survive the financial reality check. When the money they'd expected never materialized, the cracks in their foundation became canyons. I heard they divorced about 18 months after my restructuring, with Vanessa moving back to Connecticut and Trevor taking a job at a mid-tier consulting firm in Boston, as far from New York and his failures as he could manage. I felt a twinge of something when I heard that news. Not quite sadness, not quite satisfaction, just a recognition that choices have consequences, and some lessons come with a price tag attached. I'm 65 now, 3 years past that devastating wedding reception, and I'm writing this from my study overlooking a property that I actually appreciate now. Every morning I wake up knowing that the people in my life are there because they want to be, not because they're waiting for me to die so they can cash in. My company is thriving under my leadership, with a succession plan in place that will transition control to my senior management team, people who've earned their positions through loyalty and competence. My charitable foundation is changing lives and creating opportunities for people who remind me of who I was 50 years ago, hungry and determined. Trevor sent me a card last Christmas. Nothing elaborate, just a simple note saying he understood if I couldn't forgive him, but hoped maybe someday we could talk. I haven't responded. Maybe that makes me a bad father, maybe that makes me a bad person, but I think it makes me someone who finally learned that love without respect is worthless, and family without loyalty is just biology. The truth is, I don't hate my son. I don't hate Vanessa, though I certainly don't like her. I just don't care anymore. And that indifference is the most powerful thing I've ever felt. They can't hurt me because they no longer matter to me. They can't manipulate me because I've removed every lever they could pull. They thought they were cutting me out of the family, but really, they cut themselves off from everything that family represented: security, legacy, unconditional support. And they did it with such confidence, such certainty that they were the clever ones, right up until the moment they realized they'd outwitted themselves into oblivion. If you're watching this and you're going through something similar, if you're facing betrayal from people you trusted, people you sacrificed for, people who should have had your back, I want you to understand something. Revenge isn't always loud. It isn't always dramatic. Sometimes the most devastating revenge is simply protecting yourself, restructuring your life so that the people who hurt you can never do it again, and then walking away into a future they're not invited to. Sometimes justice is just letting people experience the natural consequences of their choices without cushioning the blow. My son wanted independence from his controlling father. He got it. He wanted to build his own life without my interference. he's doing it. And if that life is smaller, harder, and lonelier than he expected, well, that's what happens when you burn bridges that took 30 years to build. You don't get to walk back across the ashes and expect the bridge to reconstruct itself. Before I finish this story, I want to take a moment to talk directly to you, because if you've watched this far, if you've stayed with me through this entire journey, then you understand something important about dignity, justice, and self-respect. If this story resonated with you, if it made you feel something, if it reminded you that you don't have to accept betrayal just because it comes from family, then do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. Leave a comment telling me your thoughts. And if you haven't already, subscribe to The Mental Grand, because this is exactly the kind of story we tell here. Stories about people who refuse to be victims, who fight back with intelligence instead of emotion, who understand that sometimes the right thing to do is walk away and let karma do its work. The Mental Grand is about more than just revenge stories. It's about reclaiming your power when people try to take it. It's about understanding that you deserve respect, especially from the people you sacrificed for. It's about refusing to be diminished by people who should be lifting you up. So subscribe, turn on notifications, and join a community of people who believe that dignity is not negotiable and justice, real justice, is worth fighting for intelligently. I rebuilt my life at 62 years old. If I can do that, you can face whatever challenge you're dealing with right now. You're stronger than you think, you're smarter than they believe, and you absolutely deserve better than whatever betrayal brought you to this video today. My name is Richard Donovan, and this was my story. Remember, family isn't just about blood. It's about loyalty, respect, and standing by the people who stood by you. And when those things disappear, when the people who should love you most treat you like an obstacle to overcome, you don't owe them anything except the natural consequences of their choices. Walk away with your head high, protect what you've built, and build an even better future without them. They wanted me out of their family. I gave them exactly what they wanted, and somehow in losing them, I found myself again. That's not revenge, that's justice, that's dignity, and that's a victory to savor every single day. Thank you for watching The Mental Grand. Until next time, remember that your worth isn't determined by how others treat you. It's determined by how you treat yourself when others fail you. Stay strong, stay smart, and never let anyone convince you that you deserve less than complete respect.